Well, thank you, Callie, for that great introduction. Who is super excited to hear about the opioid epidemic? Me. Because it really is not going to start out so happy, the things we have to talk about. But we'll progress from the data piece of things to what the court's responses are and can be and should be. So we're going to start with a look at some data. So again, remember I said we're going to start in a not so happy place. This chart that you see in front of you is the overdose deaths starting from 1999 through 2016. And as you can see, it's not gotten better in 2017. The preliminary data from the CDC is in, but the final data is not. It probably won't be released until the end of the year. So this is projected based on about 22 states worth of data. But you can see, again, another sharp increase in deaths. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail, but that is really due to the huge increase and pervasiveness of drugs like fentanyl being introduced not only into heroin, but also into other drugs of choice. Because even though we call ourselves a National Judicial Opioid Task Force, what you'll hear me say numerous times today is that doesn't mean that that's the only drug that's killing people. Fentanyl is now in methamphetamine and cocaine and contributes to a number of deaths within this every year. So let's go back in time just a little bit. We know, and you've probably all heard in the news, a little bit something about a prescription drug problem in this country. So where did this come from? And I apologize because the print is a little bit small. But on the left side of the screen, you can see a very brief, I wouldn't even call it article, more like a statement, that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine many years ago. And in that article that has now been cited over 600 times, I'm just gonna read it to you since it is a little bit far away. To the editor. Recently, we examined our current files to determine the incidence of narcotic addiction in over 39,000 hospitalized medical patients who were monitored consecutively. Although there were over 11,000 patients who received at least one narcotic preparation, there were only 4 cases of reasonably well-documented addiction in patients who had no history of addiction. The addiction was considered major in only 1 instance. So, and I'm not going to read the rest, but a couple of things stand out here. This study, which was the basis for really the swing in the pendulum from doctors not prescribing opioids frequently at all to the other direction, which is the over-prescribing, which is where we have landed in this country, of opioids. Based on this study of patients that were in a hospital where they were being given medication. So we really see how this was used by pharmaceutical companies and others to really promote the change in practice of the medical community. And then in the 90s, what you see also continuing on with that information is a very significant change in the marketing plan. So you've probably seen a lot of the lawsuits and litigation against big pharma. And this is really the impetus for this. By 2013, the heroin market was also changing. Heroin got really, really, really cheap. So when people couldn't get their prescription medication, or they couldn't afford it any longer, the heroin market was right there to help them out. So the use of heroin increased quite dramatically. In 2014 is when the dreaded fentanyl really began entering the drug supply in large amounts. You see from left to right how there was, in 2006, a spike, and then all the way over in 2016, the number of reports of fentanyl. That's how drastic this change was. And we know that it takes a really, really, really small amount of fentanyl to be fatal. So this is a map of 2016 drug overdose deaths per capita. The darker the red, and in some places nearly black, it's so dark, are the highest per capita drug overdose deaths. So you'll see this, to some degree, is still a very regional problem. If you look on the East Coast, way up in the Northeast, and then as you come down a little further south, the Appalachia part of the country there. So I want you to kind of keep this map and print it in your brain because we're going to talk a little bit more about this. But you can see that there are other dark areas out west and in the southwest as well. So this is a very busy slide, but I wanted to put it in here because this was by drug type, the overdose deaths as of June of this year. And you can see that opioids is still the leader, but if you break it down and start looking at whether it's heroin or synthetic opioids, this also includes cocaine and some psychostimulants. So again, there are other drugs on the rise here in terms of overdose deaths. And then we know that this trend is going to continue, one, because of that provisional data that we saw in the first chart, but also because the DEA tracks in terms of their submissions to their labs of different kinds of drugs. So you can see in this list methamphetamine at the top of the list, followed by cocaine and then heroin, and then further on down the list you see two different kinds of fentanyl. So this is pretty scary business that we know that it's not even just heroin that has to terrify us, but it's really a number of different types of drugs, and they're continuing to be on the rise. So I'm going to turn it over to Nora to talk a little bit about child welfare data in addition to overdose data.
Thanks, Callie. Hello, everyone. I'm Nora Sydow at the National Center for State Courts and am all things children and families at the center. So I want to talk to you for a few minutes about what we know about the impact of the opioid epidemic on the child welfare system. I don't think you have to work in the courts these days to know through the media. There's been a lot of coverage nationally and locally on the impacts of the opioid epidemic on the child welfare system and the number of kids that are coming into care through the result of one or both of their parents' substance use disorder. So the data that we have about kids in foster care comes from the feds. All states, through their child welfare agency, have to report twice a year for all kids in out-of-home care through the adoption and foster care reporting system. Information about numbers of kids, demographics, all sorts of data elements. The one thing I will say about the data that we have related to substance use is that it's not very accurate, but we're working on it. The feds are working on it. So we do know, just if you compare from year to year, we do know that the number of kids that are coming into care as the result of one of their or both of their parents having a drug use problem is rising. But nationally, the data tells us only about 30% of kids. But we know, I mean, I don't know how familiar any of you are with the child welfare court process in your own jurisdiction, but if you've sat in court, most people will tell you across the country, the majority, if not every case, dependency, or they're called different things in different jurisdictions, one or both parents has a substance use disorder, whether it's opioids, some jurisdictions it's still meth or has gone back to meth. But we have, so here's some information. You can see, so this line is the number of kids in out-of-home care at the end of the federal fiscal year. So it's a snapshot in time. So on September 30th, all the way from back in 2000 to 2016. So you can see this is when the system peaked back in 2000, and there were lots of national and local efforts to reduce the number of kids coming into the system and getting them back out of the system, the front door and the back doors. And as you can see nationally, we made a lot of progress. We got down to a low of just under 400,000 kids in foster care. And then we are seeing the trend increase again. And we know, at least largely in part to, I think, the opioid epidemic. I think that's a fair thing to say across the country. One other thing I'll mention before I'll turn it, I think, back to Michelle, or to Greg, is that what we know, and this data is definitely accurate. Again, that reason, so through each state child welfare agency's SACWIS system, what they report the data to the feds, that question in there about, reasons for removal, that's where it gets a little murky and there's a lot of data quality issues. But the age of the child is, we feel pretty confident in this data. So this is the age of the child at removal. So for all kids that were in the foster care system on September 30th, 2016, how old were they when they were removed from their parent or parents? And you can see by far, it's the babies. It's the kids that were less than 1 year old. And these are the kids that, mom was either using while she was pregnant or closely after. And they came to the attention either of the hospital, the doctors, or the child welfare agency. And not just the babies, the kids under 5, that category of kids. This, I think, is directly linked to the opioid epidemic. Thanks, and I'll turn it over to Greg.
Can you hear me okay? All right. All right, so I'm one of the more recent appointees to the task force, and I'm going to be going over some of what the task force has been up to since it's been created. Early on in the process, they decided to do a survey of the Conference of Chief Justices and the Conference of State Court Administrators membership. They got responses from somewhere about 42 folks from 34 states. When they were asked about the impact of the opioid crisis in their states, the answers averaged somewhere between substantial and great, with 5 respondents noting it as extreme. So, it's probably a no-brainer to say it, but clearly the impact has been substantial around the country. Where they have a state-level opioid task force, the vast majority of them have been created by the executive branch. You can see the breakout there. It's probably about 3/4 of them. Then they asked whether or not the judiciary has been represented. You can see it's roughly about 50%. This is one of the things that the leadership of the Judicial Task Force is looking to increase the amount of participation from the judicial branch.
There we go, Rachel. Okay.
They asked about whether or not legislation has been created. It looks like roughly half of the respondents said that yes, the legislatures have been working on this. So while clearly the executive branch has been taking the lead, which probably makes sense given all the services that they provide to everybody, the legislatures also have been involved as well. Membership was asked what information would be useful to the state-level task force. Some of the top responses we have here are sample plans, information about court intervention for adults, juveniles, and families, basically what can we do for these folks, information on treatment interventions, and information regarding the impact of the opioid epidemic on courts. So from an administrative standpoint, we don't want this to overwhelm us, and information that would help us make plans for this is really what we need. Some other responses on useful information would be information regarding child welfare agencies, as we just heard, and information on prescription drug monitoring programs. Those are the ones that try to catch people who have one malady and try to go to several doctors in order to get opioids prescribed to them. And then what the courts need for to address the epidemic, I suppose it's not much of a surprise. They need funding, need training, need education. Those are the top 3. So this brief survey, I think it's clear we have a serious and pervasive problem that we need to deal with, that all 3 branches of government are engaged with this. And at the moment, again, the executive branch is the one taking most of the lead there. Courts need information, treatment options, education, funding, training, and they need to develop innovative practices. So I mentioned previously that the leadership of the task force feels strongly that the judicial branch should be included in state task force, and they would extend that to local and county as well. And I guess maybe the question to a lot of folks might be why. But we all do this sort of work, so maybe the answer is obvious to you. We have direct contact with an awful lot of folks who are struggling with this. We're having contact at a time that they're likely in crisis. And with that combination and the fact that we had the power of the bench, what we do with these folks can have a significant impact in trying to help them out. Obviously, criminal cases, you have possession cases, you have DUIs, a lot of other crimes that aren't necessarily drug crimes. There's involvement of drugs in them. Family cases, juveniles have the exact same issues as the adults as far as the criminality. But then, of course, you have a lot of folks that you have to deal with the family, with kids, and also with schools. An awful lot of times, again, as we said, child protection cases, the part of the problem or maybe the whole problem with the parents is that they're suffering from substance use disorder. Oftentimes in domestic violence, it's prevalent. And then maybe not think about it too much, but for civil dockets, especially family, oftentimes there's addiction problems that cause problems with custody, visitation, and so forth. And then finally, pretrial services and probation. Obviously, the monitoring and supervising these clients can be a very tough population to deal with. There's often, there's added costs as far as drug testing and also the cost of staff having to be more intensive with the clients. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a brief outline on what the National Task Force has been up to. Last August, there was a joint resolution from the two organizations to form this task force. The next month, an executive committee was appointed. You can see there that the two chairs, the Indiana Chief Justice Loretta Rush and the State Court Administrator for Tennessee, Deborah Taylor Tate. They have a total of 5 Chief Justices, 5 court administrators on the task force. That same month of September, funding from SJI was awarded to help the efforts. The survey that I mentioned was conducted the very next month. And then in November, and then subsequently in January, the executive committee met. In March, we have a website launched. The rest of the membership of the task force was announced. And we started to meet by phone with the work groups. This past April, they finalized 5 principles that I'll go over in a moment, and they launched an additional website, the National Judicial Opioid Task Force. And then in June, we had the first face-to-face meeting of the full task force. We had quite a lot of presentations from quite a lot of experts, an amazing amount of information. I think one of the things we're finding is that we're not going to have to invent a lot of new things. We need to find them, we need to organize them, and make sure they're digestible for the judiciary around the country. So here are those 5 principles that the task force are following. They want a comprehensive approach, so basically any time that we meet people suffering from this sort of from a substance use disorder, and it's not just in the criminal justice system, we want to make sure that we maximize our effect at those points. Next thing says all hands on deck. That's really a way of saying that it's not just about the judiciary, it's really about all system partners coming together. I don't know about you, but it's something about a judge. They call it the power of convening. I've seen it for other things, and in this one, I think we need to take full advantage of that. We want to make sure that we're tailoring treatments and services to individuals. I know we do that, but we want to make sure we perfect that. We want to ensure the whole family is considered, get the parents the treatment they need, get the children a stable and loving environment, and do the best we can to stop the cycle of addiction from affecting future generations. And then using data-driven approaches, obviously we want to maximize our effects, and using the data and examining it and following it will be the way we do that. Task force has been broken out into 3 work groups. The first one here is focused on children and families. I'm going to be looking for that's a hard word. People working together in a collaborative way to provide services to families. You'll see here one of the interesting things is the use of pre-petition courts to try and prevent entry into foster care. Second work group is a civil and criminal justice work group. Here we're encouraging collaboration again with all system partners throughout the justice system, not just criminal. We're looking for screening and assessment tools that will help match needs and services, And on the civil side, they're going to be considering the use of civil commitments for people with SUD. And the final group is the Collaboration and Education Working Group. We're going to be looking to provide a toolkit to the courts on a whole variety of subjects. Michelle has an amazing amount of links that we're trying to organize and make useful for everyone. We're creating curriculum for judges, and we're encouraging the participation of the judiciary in all levels of these task force. So that's the quick overview of what the task force has been up to. Thank you for your time. We're going back to Michelle, I think.
Okay, now we get into what is the court doing, not just what the task force is doing, but what are some effective approaches. So hopefully many of you have heard of the sequential intercept model, yes? So this is really taking the system, usually the criminal justice system, but the system, and identifying all of the decision-making points or points when people can intervene, agencies, whoever it might be. When I first saw this model many years ago, there were only intercepts 1 through 5. In recent years, they've added intercept 0, which is even before law enforcement gets involved. So you're really looking here at every single place the system makes a decision or has the ability to intervene and do something that supports moving a person towards recovery or whatever the most appropriate outcome is. And so one of the things we are really asking communities to do, and ideally, as Greg said, having the court not only involved, but using the power of the court to convene people and bring them together to do mapping just like this. All right, so do you remember the map I showed you and the Appalachia part of the country that was deep red, in some places almost black? It was so dark in terms of the high rate of overdoses. So in response to that, almost 2 years ago now, the Chief Justice O'Connor in Ohio had a convening where she brought together multiple states from that region to really have an honest discussion about the crisis and what the courts could do. And this is really new and different on multiple levels. One of the first times the courts really said we need to get heavily involved and coordinate our efforts. And 2, a multi-state, ultimately 8 states, signed the charter to actually form the Regional Judicial Opioid Initiative. So it's a whole lot of people in a number of states collaboratively working together across branches and across levels of government. So local, state, and we partner with folks in the federal government as well. So through the work of what I call our joy, because it makes it sound like a happier thing to do, we've had a lot of discussions around what really is the judiciary's role in this. What can the courts do? So we asked that question of the judges from those 8 states. What are the courts uniquely positioned to do? So the easiest thing to talk about is leverage. The courts can order folks to do things, such as be screened, be assessed, attend treatment, and many, many, many other things. They can educate themselves. So as Greg talked about, we are working hard to determine the best way to deliver that training, whether it's in person, remote, online, quick, short little videos, or quite long, all-day seminars. And hopefully we'll come to the place of having all of that and more. They also can educate others about what the court can and cannot do. We've talked a lot about convening. They can bring people together and also use their platform in the community to support all solutions. While the court can't be involved in every piece of that intercept model that was on the screen a few minutes ago, they can support having resources and programs and projects at each of those intercept points. And then we also talked about what outcomes do the courts want, how can they achieve those outcomes, and maybe most importantly, who do we need to work with? Because again, as Greg mentioned, the courts have a lot of things that we can do, but in order to do them, we have to work with others, especially in the executive branch, because they have everything. We have to make friends with them and figure out what they do have and where there are shortages in resources, and then work with them to go find the appropriate resources and solutions. So this is an annotated list of who we have asked in each of the states to be members of a state team, or at least be available to work, depending on which projects. These are people who, many years ago when I was a probation officer, I never would have thought I needed to work with these folks. Some of these agencies I didn't know existed. So it's been a very interesting learning process to think about all of the people and all of the resources that actually really do exist at the local and state level. We just need to go and find them and educate ourselves on what their roles are, what they can do, and how they can be helpful to us. So everything from the pharmacy board to prescription drug monitoring program, state licensing boards. I had no idea that anyone in this room, could just call up the state licensing board and file a complaint about a doctor who you didn't feel like was doing things, or somebody who was licensed by that board was doing things appropriately. Who knew? I didn't know. State Opioid Treatment Authority. I made a bad joke, and I'll make it again. They're called sodas, and I said the only soda I ever knew about was a Coca-Cola. But this is an authority in every state that is responsible for really managing the providers of the opioid medication-assisted treatment. And they're a very important resource to know about. Certainly health departments, we talk a whole lot about drug courts when we say this, the court solution to any substance use disorder or this epidemic in particular is, well, we'll just get more drug courts, problem solved. That's not, it's a solution, not the solution. Drug courts are great, big believer, used to be a program manager for a drug court, loved it, travel the country and evaluate them, they do amazing work. There are not enough of them, and they can't serve everyone, and they're not right for everyone. So the courts need to think outside of the problem-solving court box about what the solutions are to this epidemic. And then many, many more. So what are some other things that courts can do? Identifying risk for overdose. So we get ourselves caught up a lot of times in the justice system about we need to hold people accountable and we need to make sure they do what the court orders them to do. Yes, those are very important things, but if they're dead, it doesn't matter. So we really need to think about how do we identify those at the highest risk for overdose and make sure we are holding them accountable, but two, that we are also connecting them to the services they need so we can continue to hold them accountable. So there are a number of folks, or a number of instruments out there, but one, and you can link to it from the hyperlink and the word tool here at the bottom after you get the presentation, is a really good resource. But there are a number of areas that are deem a person high risk. One that is most important for the folks in the justice system is when a person is released from either incarceration or residential treatment, extremely high risk for a either lethal or non-lethal overdose. So really need to make sure that we're identifying who those folks are and connecting them to treatment. Availability and use of naloxone. You probably, if you don't know what naloxone is, you probably heard of Narcan, which is, it's the same thing. So interestingly, when I started asking questions about the courts and who has access to and who uses and who carries Narcan, I was surprised. There are a lot of probation and pretrial agencies now who do field work where they carry naloxone, and their officers are trained to use it. There are a lot of agencies, court agencies, where it's accessible in offices and in courthouses. I've talked to a lot of judges who have said, we have overdoses in our courthouse every day. So the sheriff's office is equipped to respond, court security, and other folks that are in the courthouse are trained as well. I've even heard them say that the defibrillators that you find on the walls, next to them is a box and it has naloxone in it as well. This is a real thing, and it's really important for people to be prepared. So the use of that, and also there's a lot of jails and prisons now where this is a significant issue, that when an inmate is released, they put naloxone kits in their property. So it's important to know and understand and be trained and be prepared for administering that. So we talk a whole lot about treatment, and we not everybody has been trained on what effective treatment looks like. And it's really important to understand what the full continuum of care, meaning what every everything that a person might need, including everything from residential all the way down to just outpatient or support services, and ideally having access to all of those, from licensed, credentialed, accredited, quality, the best quality that you can find in your community. Quality seems to be an issue that I actually hear about a whole lot more even than access, with the exception of rural communities. So a lot of judges being very, very concerned about the quality of the treatment that is provided in their communities, and how do they determine what a quality provider is. Okay, so one example of something very specific that the courts have done, many of you may have heard of the Buffalo Opioid Court. Well, it's not exactly a drug court, and so it's a little bit of a misnomer. It actually is more like a diversion program. So what's amazing about this and the work that Judge Hanna has done in Buffalo is that usually within about 48 to 72 hours from a person being arrested, screened, and assessed, they are connected to services. And then in the early stages of their participation in this intervention court, they go to court every day. They're in front of Judge Hanna every day, and they are questioned about how they are doing, whether they are getting what they need, and whether they are being, they're held accountable for going to treatment and everything else that it is they're supposed to do. Meanwhile, their criminal case is put on hold for 60 days usually. They may go to residential treatment, they may be connected to medication-assisted treatment, and all of the other recovery support and wraparound services. And then at the end of that period of time, when the criminal case resumes, anything from being dismissed all the way through going into Buffalo's drug treatment court program after this occurs. So there's a lot of information online. I think I have recorded at least one, maybe two webinars with Judge Hanna at this point. And on the National Task Force website, there's also a link to the PowerPoint that he does if you all are looking for more information, or certainly you can email me and ask me about more. Jail and prison reentry, we talked a little bit about the Narcan being given to folks when they are released. There also are a number of jails and prisons now across the country that are actually providing medication-assisted treatment while someone is incarcerated, whether it's just induction, so getting them assessed and immediately connected prior to release, or whether it's maintenance because they're on the medication when they enter the facility. And they're also getting support services, ideally, while they're there. And you've heard of the phrase warm handoff. Some of the best I have seen are when they are they're connected directly to a community provider. And in one specific instance that I'm aware of, when a person is released, they're met at the jail door by a peer mentor, given a voucher for a taxi cab, and taken directly to the community treatment provider. So I call that a hot handoff. That's not even warm. That's getting a person from A to B. So there's some really innovative, and that's Denver County Jail in Colorado that does that. It's a really amazing program, but there are many others, like the one in Massachusetts. So we also have a lot of issues and barriers in rural communities where the availability of treatment services, for any of you who work in any of those rural communities, is a real problem for you every single day. And we understand and can appreciate that there might not be any treatment for 4 hours away or even longer. And then if it is, the transportation is an issue, and lots of other barriers are there. So we are really exploring the use of technology, telemedicine, teleservices, whatever you like to call it, to be able to put the ability for anyone, anywhere, to attend treatment right in the palm of their hand. And there's some really cool stuff out there. If you've ever looked, there are apps, there's a lot of really innovative stuff. There's a couple of judges that are on our task force from Montana. I kind of made the joke, I didn't think it was a joke, but I made the joke that I think they could do anything remotely except for literally put handcuffs on somebody. And one of the judges said to me, "Nope, I got a plan for that." And that was a bailiff or someone where that person was making that happen for them. But everything else they can do. Training, drug court team staffing, drug court sessions, treatment. I think Judge Nicely said they could even do yoga classes if they wanted to. So we're talking the full gamut of recovery support services. There's other things like I said, smartphone apps, supervision kiosks are used really frequently now, I think. I just learned one state where they don't even really have folks come into the probation department any longer. All the work is done in the field, and there's a whole lot of technology in place to be able to support that. Prescription drug monitoring programs, or PDMPs, many states have granted access, particularly to drug court judges or drug court teams related to the prescription drug monitoring program in the state. It provides a history of controlled substance prescriptions, current prescriptions. If you remember when we talked about really where the uptick of this crisis started, it was with prescription drugs. Many states have really, really made a lot of great strides in this area. I will tell you, just having access to this and not knowing what to do with the information is not helpful. I think it's really important to understand what this system can provide you and what it cannot. It is not a solve everything, but it is an effective tool in your tool belt in knowing and understanding, particularly if you have someone who's court involved that has a prescription drug issue. And then Nora is going to talk really quickly about some really innovative child welfare related programs, and then we'll move on really quick to talk about some funding.
Really quickly, what are jurisdictions doing to improve and intervene in these families that are dealing with substance use disorder and the foster care system? I'll skip down to family drug courts first. Like Michelle said, it's not the solution, but we've seen a tremendous growth in family drug courts. Sometimes they're called dependency drug courts, but this is the drug court for families who have had their kids removed or facing removal because of a substance use disorder. Just a statistic, in 1999, nationally, there were 10 family drug courts. In 2018, there were 495, with 45 of those just increasing from last year. So we're seeing a big growth. There's 4 different models of a family drug court. The parallel model, which is where the dependency case, the child protection case, the legal process proceeds on a different track, sometimes in front of a different judge or judicial officer from the recovery management process. The integrated model, it is what it sounds like. Those two processes are together in front of the same judge, same docket, et cetera. The dual track or hybrid model, that's where initially they start off in the same process in front of the same judicial officer, and then the non-compliant cases move to a separate process. More recently, we're hearing most people are calling it the infusion model, but we know through research that family drug courts, when implemented with fidelity according to best practices, can be very effective and successful for a lot of parents. So the question is, well, why don't we just integrate those core principles? There are now 7 we've recognized as the core part of what makes family drug courts work. Why don't we do that for all child protection cases? So we have several states, Colorado and Ohio are the 2 examples that are trying to figure that out on a statewide level, as in New York, locally, Ithaca, New York is another example. The START program, I'm going to talk really fast, Michelle keeps looking at me. This is a multidisciplinary kind of, it's a wraparound idea. It started in Ohio, but it's spread to other jurisdictions, including Kentucky. Elements of this are a team approach. The teams are very limited in caseload. I think the recommendation is only 13 families per team. One of the other key elements of the START program is a parent partner or a peer mentor, but another person who has gone through the child protection process as a parent, as a consumer, as a client, that is assigned or attached to that parent. That's another intervention. Down at the bottom, baby courts, early childhood courts, they're called different things, but they target, some are 0 to 3, some are 0 to 5. They really focus on the relationship between the parent and child and include an intervention such as child-parent psychotherapy, but something that really addresses issues of like bonding and attachment and really focus on restoring that parent-child relationship. Really quickly, one more thing that's not on the slide. The federal government just this year has funded a new project called the Quality Improvement Center on Collaborative Community Court Teams. It's a mouthful, but what it is, it selected 15 demonstration sites, so courts from across the country in 8 different states, to implement a process that really is targeting the population that we're talking about here today. So targeting either pregnant women or women that have just given birth that we know or come to know that are suffering with a substance use disorder. And it's a process that really is encouraging the courts, the grantees in this project, to collaborate with the medical community, which you see integrated in some of the other interventions, but that's really the core focus of this project. So really kind of backing up, really looking more on the prevention side, upstream, so to speak, with these parents, targeting them maybe even before they give birth. Right, thanks.
Thank you. I got it. Yeah. Thanks. You didn't have to talk that fast, Nora. I am? Okay. Okay, so usually what people really, really, really want to hear about, there's a lot of money, bags, buckets, truckloads full of money right now that the federal government is putting out in grant solicitations. Actually, the grant cycle is over, but there will be more, trust me. The primary places to look for that, and I'm going to start at the bottom of the slide and we'll go back to the top, is that if you're not familiar with grants.gov, if you've never been there, you've never played with it, you've never submitted a grant, written a grant, managed a grant, if you don't hear me say anything else today, it is go to grants.gov if you're looking for a way to fund a program or project, and not just related to the opioid epidemic, but really anything that the federal government would fund. What is that phrase? Get familiar. Grants.gov. Go there, sign up. You will get, if you so choose, daily notifications of grant solicitations that have been released. I would strongly encourage you to apply a filter to that, or you will get lists of many, many things that you never knew the federal government was involved in, and really try to hone in on the areas that would be specific to things that you would want funding for. So the primary places where it makes sense for courts to either apply themselves or to collaborate and have an executive branch agency apply. The Department of Health and Human Services, this is where especially drug courts are really getting a lot of great federal funding, particularly from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Courts are eligible to apply for a lot of these grants. If they're not, again, collaborate and work with the agencies, whether it's a local or state agency, and have conversations and apply for these funds. The Department of Justice, through the Bureau of Justice Assistance, or for Juvenile Justice, OJJDP, and interestingly, even the Office for Victims of Crime, and that's not just about domestic violence anymore. There's money that they are collaborating with some of the other federal agencies around the opioid epidemic. And one that was the most shocking to me, in a good way, that I learned about recently was the USDA. They have an amazing, and I don't have it up here, but if you just Google USDA and opioids, they have an incredible amount of information, funding. This is really for rural communities to take advantage of. So if you're in a rural community, I would strongly suggest you go on that website, look around, and there's a lot of information, but also there's a fair amount of funding that the USDA has specifically in response to the opioid epidemic, and they want to hear what the court's needs are. And then last but certainly not least on this list is the Veterans Administration. This isn't necessarily that the court would get money from them, but certainly to know what they offer, because there are a lot of justice-involved vets in all of our courts. And so really know and understand how you can link to the Veterans Administration. If you don't know who your VJO is for the area that you live in, recommend you find out who that is as well. They are a direct line for people that are justice involved into services at the Veterans Administration. Okay, so a couple of other resources, and we're just going to toot our own horns a little bit because we're super excited about these web pages, is the main page we have created is called Opioids in the Courts. And then the task force, as Greg mentioned earlier, has a page that we are going to really push out all of the deliverables as we produce them. And then the regional initiative also has one coming soon. I'm not sure that we have connectivity to the internet, but I'll try really quick to, maybe not. Okay. I was hoping to show you. If you go to that website and there's something that's missing and you know that it should be there, please feel free to email me. If there's something that's not there that you're looking for, please email me and we'll go find it for you. But there really is an incredible amount of information. At the bottom of the Opioids and Courts page, we do a weekly kind of newsletter of updates about opioids and courts in the news. If you have news, please share it with me. If you are looking for what is in the news, it's a great place to find it. And then again, as I mentioned, we also have a page that is just for what the work the task force is doing, including all of our convenings and speakers and all of that great stuff. So if anything's missing, please let me know. If it's not stuff that you can use, but you know what you could use, this is really designed for the field. I come from the field. We all come from the field that are involved in this. We want to make this useful for you all that are out there combating this crisis every single day. So please let us know how we can be helpful in that. And then I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Questions?
Anybody want to brag about something great they're doing in their community related to this?
You want to know more about the bags of money that Michelle bought?
I don't carry them around. They're not my bags. Nothing?
I'm going to give a...
Got one over there.
Good. Well, I'll give a shout out because they really do have some great resources. I hope you will use them.
We have a countywide opiate task force that I'm slightly involved in, and one great thing that's launched through funding through our Attorney General is a task force that meets with everyone on Thursday of every week if you've overdosed the prior week. Quick response team. It's probably not novel, but it's a very rural community. We only have 92,000 people in our whole county. But it's made efforts already. They've made good results already. I think since October, there's not been any overdose deaths.
That's great.
There's one thing that they're starting to talk about, and it came from the federal courts because they don't have a lot of resources to do this sort of supervision, especially like drug court supervision. So they've actually started working on an MOU between the federal court in a particular jurisdiction and the county court for the federal court to give up jurisdiction to the county court so their person can end up going through drug court. And the reason that's relevant as well is we're also thinking that might be some kind of applicability in a rural setting to do the same thing, even with a tribal court, same thing potentially.
And quick response teams are something that the federal government does fund through those grants. And usually you hear about them. It's amazing you're talking about that the courts are even part of that conversation. In many communities, it really is more like EMS and law enforcement and a treatment provider or a peer support mentor that is heavily involved in maybe the emergency room in a local hospital. But it's really great that in your instance, it seems to be a much broader collaboration. So the other thing I would urge that if you know those other things exist that at the local level, the county commission or board of supervisors or whatever you call it is, and somehow the court's invitation to join got lost in the mail, ask a judge to invite themselves. Go to the meetings. I met with a bunch of sheriffs recently and said to them, you know, it struck me at some point in our conversation that in every single community across this entire country, there's a sheriff and there's at least one judge. And so if those people work together to do this, the ability to bring people together and resources together and convene people and the respect they have in the community, imagine all the things you could accomplish. So it really is about reaching out into the executive branch and looking at that Intercept and just invite yourself.
I would also think you should realize that this problem it goes everywhere in our system. And we were talking, a lot of us work for a superior court and that's what we think about, but in my jurisdiction we did unofficial numbers, a count of how many people in my probation department we've lost to overdose death. And we figured out that in the last year, came close to 20% of all overdose deaths in the entire county, which is rather significant. And then when you go into a little bit further, where we are, even though we're a superior court, we also do supervision of municipal court or a limited jurisdiction court defendants. And a lot of those deaths were basically conditional dismissals, where they get sent to the Superior Court. We drug test them once, send them out, and if they're fined for a year, they get dismissed. Well, they're not fined for a year. They're actually passing away. So the reason I'm bringing this up is no matter what, we need to make sure the municipal courts, the lower courts are aware that this is a real thing, and that if they're either arrested or charged with something with opioids, or we drug test them and find that we may need to think of a more intensive response than just the regular. It's like I said, it's just at all levels, and we have to remember that.
Any other questions, or anybody want to brag about what you're doing in your area?
Is everybody going to go home and start asking a whole lot more questions about what's going on in your community? Because really, that's the first step. If you come and you say, oh, maybe I don't know enough about this, that is a really, really important step to then go home and start digging around and asking. Because the other thing, too, that the task force talks a lot about is that, and I hammered on this quite a bit, this is not really just an opioid crisis. Methamphetamine is real and a problem, and in some places it's always been a problem that's bigger than the opioid epidemic will ever be. So what we're also trying to do, and would encourage others to do, is build something that is not just about the opioid crisis, that it is something much more sustainable and nimble to be able to react to whatever the next drug of choice is. Because what we know from years of research and looking at this is, for example, that after every opioid crisis, there's a stimulant drug crisis, and it will keep happening and keep happening and keep happening. And maybe we can't stop it from happening, but what we can do is be responsive. So I would encourage all of you all to go back and think about, in terms of your planning, the money might say it's for opioids, but you can build things in a way that's responsive to just anyone that is just as involved with a substance misuse.